Let us explain. The Western world wants a Christ without a cross, in the sense that it does not want mortification, self-discipline. It does not want to hear of these things. That is one of the reasons why there's juvenile delinquency. Carried self-expression to such an extreme that it means license. We do not want a Christ in our Western world whose hands are scarred. We want a lily white hand. And the result is that we have a Christ who does not preach sacrifice and discipline, a feminine Christ, a weak Christ, full of cheap moralizations.
Travel along, Catholic pilgrims, for 1 year as we learn from Venerable Fulton Sheen, one of the greatest Catholic teachers in modern times. Join me, Amy Thomas, once a week for a short reading out of Bishop Sheen's book, Way to Inner Peace. Welcome to week 17, Catholic pilgrims. This week we are going to be talking about melancholy. Now, I think a lot of us have an idea of what being melancholy means, and I think most of us think that it's, a little sadness. You're a little down in the dumps for a little bit. But when I actually went and read on the internet what the definition of melancholy means, it's a deep gloom. It's a depressed state for a prolonged period of time. Now, that's very different than I think what most of us think about when we think about someone who's melancholy. And so that changed how I read this entire section today. And because at first when I was like, okay, everybody has a down day now and then, I even asked my husband what he thought it meant. And he even asked me, well, what does it mean exactly? I need to know what it means exactly. And so that's when I went and looked it up, and I was like, oh, it's a deep, deep gloom for a prolonged period of time. And then when I went back and read our readings for today, I was like, okay, now this all makes sense. So I'm going to do a lot of teaching today, and I really want you to come along with me. I know sometimes when Bishop Sheen throws names out at us that maybe we don't know exactly who they are, we can kind of glaze over that, but he is going to throw out names to us today, and it's really important that we understand why he brought these names up. And so I'm going to put on my teaching cap today because this is a really, really good reading. And it is, again, so pertinent to what we are looking at today. And there are philosophies that are going to come from the men that he speaks about that you are going to be able to see how they have directly influenced 2022, the time that we live in right now. So that's why I think it's so important that we learn a little bit about them. So I think it's going to be interesting because maybe you've heard about them, maybe you haven't, or maybe you've heard their names, but you don't really know exactly who they are. So come along with me. Let's learn some deeper things. So the 3 points to key in on today are emptiness, disillusionment, and deliverance. Number 17, melancholy. Melancholy is a strictly modern phenomenon made by the wings of the soul beating against the bars of the cage of time. The greatest analyst on this subject, Søren Kierkegaard, once expressed his own personal melancholy as follows, quote, "I have just returned from a party of which I was the life and soul. Wit poured from my lips, everyone laughed and admired me, but I left. And the dash should be as long as the Earth's orbit. And I wanted to shoot myself." This type of melancholy is not so much due to the burdens of life as it is to a reaction from its pleasures. Nero, one of the greatest of all sensualists, was notoriously melancholic. In more religious days of the past, the pleasure addict had remorse, which implied conscience. But melancholy, unlike remorse, is devoid of conscious ethical consideration. It is an emptiness that comes from having spent too riotously the honeyed pleasures of the body. It is a horrifying sense of barren activity, romantic nothingness, and the futility of life itself. Those who are unhappy try to escape by losing themselves in excitements, stimulants, and erotic experiences. But instead of any of these being a bed where they may feather their nest in repose, each turns out to be a rubber wall which makes them rebound upon themselves. The very self from which they sought release is now the very self which tortures them. The more they try to lose themselves, the more they find themselves. They breathe in the same air they breathed out, and each time it becomes more polluted and less bearable. Melancholy thus produces what might be called reduplication. The self is confronted with self. A prisoner escaped one night from a prison, walked all night, swam a river twice, and at sunup found himself back at the very prison from which he escaped. The melancholic is like this. He is always trying to get away from himself, but all the roads he takes are circular, and he meets himself coming back. It is not a pleasing sensation any more than the first glance in the mirror on awakening. There is the inescapable thou and the I, and there hardly seems to be room for both in the apartment of the soul. Those without a goal in life go fishing for pleasure, and on the hook they catch themselves not in enjoyment, but in disillusionment and suffering. At this point, one or two things may happen. First, a person may become defiant about his despair, and if he is an author, may write a drama or a novel proving that melancholy is the lot of humanity. Having burned his hand on the fires of egotism, he may seek relief by describing burns as normal and conflagrations as hearths where hearts may warm themselves. Evil is always easier to write about than goodness because all people have some experience of evil, but not all have a major experience in virtue. The nightmares of despair and melancholy that provide themes for the stage and movies bear witness to the frustration in many modern souls and to their ineffectual attempts at purgation by spreading the epidemic. But there is another possible reaction to melancholy than defiance, and that is realizing that one is locked in a combat with self. As soon as one sees that his mind is a battlefield in which the personality, which is split, is waging a war, one begins to look for a peacemaker. The two have to get together, used so often in speaking of social and international disputes, is now applied to self. Obviously, peace cannot come from within, for that is the source of all the trouble. The mind is like a willow tree whose branches are already wet with tears. As the sun alone can dry the dampness of the tree, so now the melancholic mind looks outside itself for help and deliverance. And this is the way many a modern mind is finding God, through the emptiness of self and the despair within. It has always been known that a person could come to God through a series of disgust, but it remained for our day to form it into a pattern. The contradiction within, which drives the defiant melancholic individual to suicide, is the same force which drives the self-acknowledged melancholic to God. Sartre is the world's spokesman for the despair that prefaces hell, and Kierkegaard the spokesman for those who in the darkness of their self-sealed tombs cry for light. The modern mind has been closed to God for a long time, but it seems now that God is finding his way back as he did at the beginning of Christian history, coming once more through closed doors. Okay, so there are names in here that we need to talk about. I'm pretty sure most of you have heard of Nero because Nero was that famous emperor in the first century of the Roman Empire, and we all have heard about how kind of crazy he was, and he was a pleasure seeker. I mean, there's stories of Nero where he would have like these races, guys would come out to race, and Nero would be involved in the race, and all the other guys, it was known, you're going to lose. Just blow the race. Don't even try to win. Let Nero win so that he can feel really good about himself and, be crowned the champion and, hail the conquering hero type of thing. And Nero even knew this himself. And yet he wanted so badly to have that moment to where he felt like he was really doing something that he went along with everybody just throwing the race, knowing that one of them was probably faster than him. I mean, that's a level of, pride that even I can't understand, and I struggle mightily with pride. But Nero did throw himself into all kinds of worldly pleasures, and they got more exotic and more exotic, and by that I mean more perverse and degrading and just awful, because that's usually what tends to happen when we only seek pleasures for happiness. So I'm pretty sure you all know his name, but Kierkegaard and Sartre, he's a Frenchman. I know I'm probably butchering his name, but my family always makes fun of me when I try to say words from other languages with their accent. And so I'm just going to go full board Kansas and just say it, how I would as a Kansas girl. So Sartre was a Frenchman. And I'm pretty sure most of us don't quite know who he is, unless maybe you're listening to this and you grew up in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Then you probably have heard his name. But I had never heard his name. Now, Kierkegaard I had, because I did study him somewhat in college, but not a ton. I knew he was a Marxist, but I could not quite remember what his philosophy was. So to understand this week's reading, we really got to understand these two guys. So again, as you're reading through this, you see now why being melancholy isn't just like, I'm just having a down day. No, it's way more than that. And so looking around our world, especially if you live in a first world country, there is a lot of people who are melancholy. My goodness, once I realized exactly what the definition was, it was very easy for me to go, oh my gosh, yes, I see people who are melancholy all the time in the media, in social media, all those different places. It's really prevalent. So now let's talk about Kierkegaard. But first we need to go back to Plato and Aristotle. Remember, hang with me because we're going to learn something along the way. I know these names are like, the ancients, but they're fascinating, really. So Plato and Aristotle, they were before Jesus, but they still believed that people were born with an essence. Actually, they believed you had that essence before you were even born, that there was that something about you. There was a purpose. There was something unique about your soul, and there was an essence about you, and you were meant to find your essence and to live it out. Now, again, they were before Christ, but they're on to something. And St. Thomas Aquinas would agree with a lot of what they had to say. Now, flash forward to Kierkegaard, who was into the 1800 time frame. He was a Marxist, believing in communism and those types of things. But his philosophy was called existentialism. Now, what is that? Well, it's a belief. It's a philosophy that says, no. You're not born with an essence. You're just born. You exist. You come into existence. And then it's up to you to find what your essence is. And it's all up to you. Now, Kierkegaard did believe in God. He just felt like God did not have any, really interactions in our lives. He kind of brought everything into being, and then he just kind of left it as such. And so he did not believe that God gave anybody a purpose. And he felt that the universe and life was purposeless and meaningless. Ugh, can you imagine thinking that? I can't imagine thinking that. Not only because it's not true, but just how heavy. So anyway, it's up to each individual person to just find out what you think your meaning is. And, just do whatever you feel is best. And we know as Christians that that's a very, very faulty way of thinking. So even online, Kierkegaard is regarded as being a melancholy personality. And you read through his writings, and he really was. Because imagine if you thought that life, everything in it was purposeless and meaningless. And that's just up to you to find a way. Now let's move into the 20th century. And we've got Sartre. And Sartre was also an existentialist. And he was, influenced by Kierkegaard. He took it even further. And he said, okay, so there's no purpose or meaning to any of this. It's all irrational. There is no God. He did not believe in a God. There's no absolutes at all, which is so ironic because he just states an absolute. And he also said there's nobody that can give you answers to anything. No religion, no government, no parent, nobody, except for him, of course. You always gotta follow these philosophies to their end point. And when you do, you see the absurdity in it. He contradicts himself twice. He says, nobody can give you answers, except here I am giving you answers, telling you that there's no point to life and all of this stuff. And then he says there's no absolutes. But in saying that, he's stating what he believes to be an absolute. So he contradicts himself twice. So when that happens, we can see that I'm not quite sure that your philosophy is on solid ground. So anyway, he talks about how each person just has to go and find their meaning. Nobody can give you any answers. It's all up to you. And so basically, just go make yourself happy. Whatever makes you happy, just go do it. And you need to live, now wait for it, your authentic self, whatever that may be. Oh my gosh, where have we heard that? Do we hear that all the time today? Yes, we do. Live your authentic self. You need to live authentically. What does that even mean if life is purposeless and meaningless? Think back to last week. We were talking about the clashing of the egos, right? This is what happens because, okay, over here, you think that life is purposeless and meaningless. And so you're just going to set out to do whatever you think makes you happy. And all you care about is your ego. And then the person next to you has the same philosophy. What's going to happen? You're both going to clash. And then, the first person's going to say to the second person, who are you to tell me I can't do these things? There's no moral absolutes. I'm just living my authentic self. And the second person can say, but what you're doing is wrong. It's morally wrong. And the first person says, but you have no answers. I have only to answer to myself. And this is what I want to do. And so I'm going to do it. Wow. That is what we have going on right now. Do you see how the philosophies of these two men, Kierkegaard and Sartre, have heavily influenced the way that we think about the world today? So now let's go. We've got that backing. Now let's go dive into Bishop Sheen. And this will help bring it out a little bit more to us so we can fully understand what he's saying. I'm going to go up here to the top of page 59 on the second page of our readings. Bishop Sheen says, this type of melancholy is not so much due to the burdens of life as it is to reaction from its pleasures. Nero, one of the greatest of all sensualists, was notoriously melancholic. But then I'm going to jump down just a little bit. But melancholy, unlike remorse, is devoid of conscious ethical consideration. It is an emptiness that comes from having spent too riotously the honeyed pleasures of the body. It is a horrifying sense of barren activity, romantic nothingness, and the futility of life itself. This is existentialism, right? Throw yourself into pleasures, and what are you going to find there? Just barren activity, romantic nothingness, the futility of life. It's all meaningless. It's all purposeless. And so what does Bishop Sheen say people try to do? Well, those who are unhappy try to escape by losing themselves in excitement, stimulants, and erotic experiences. I read somewhere else in another book of Bishop Sheen that he said something like, if you ate chocolate cake every day, at some point, you're going to be sick of chocolate cake. Even by probably the third or fourth day, you're going to be like, ugh, this chocolate cake, I'm so sick of it. Even though it's a pleasure, right? Chocolate cake is a pleasure and we all enjoy it. But if you throw yourself into pleasures too much, they start to become barren activities. But we're trying to make ourselves happy, right? And so what are we going to do? Well, I got to find something else to stimulate me. I got to find some other excitement. And so we, step it up a notch. We do something else to try to bring about pleasure. And this is how so many people start out, dabbling in their pleasures and giving into them pretty frequently. This is how we get to the point where our pleasures can turn into really, really bad and evil things because we're always trying to kind of one up it. That's why we see marijuana use leading to other drugs, because at a certain point, marijuana use just doesn't quite cut it anymore. And I want that excitement. I want that high. And so I need something else to stimulate me. And so I'm going to go to the next drug. This is also why we see, a pattern in porn users. They go from, kind of watching the, not too bad, quote unquote, stuff to falling all the way down into child pornography because the quote unquote soft stuff just isn't working anymore. And so you need something that stimulates you a little bit more and is a little bit more erotic. And then that becomes a barren activity. And so you need something else. And so we can see how pleasures can really take us down a very, very dark rabbit hole, but they leave us melancholy because as soon as you're done with that activity, the happiness is gone. And so what do I do now? Oh, life is boring. Life is futile. There's no meaning. There's no purpose. Oh, what's the next thing I can do to make myself feel good? And that's what we see. I mean, Kierkegaard in his quote says it so perfectly. He says, I had just returned from a party in which I was the life and the soul. Wit poured from my lips. Everyone laughed and admired me. But when I left, I wanted to shoot myself because it wasn't lasting. It wasn't enough. It ended. That temporary happiness ended. And because he saw life as pointless and meaningless, once the happiness was over, the weight of the nothingness was upon him. So let's move on. He says the melancholic is like this. He is always trying to get away from himself. We don't want to face ourselves. We don't want to sit with our thoughts. We don't want to think about that there is a God, that we do have a purpose. And we don't want to look at how far we've let ourselves fall and slip into things that are potentially evil, just vices that are not good for us. We don't want to face those things. And so that makes us even more sad. And so if you remove God, all you have is entertainment. And that's what we see in our life. We see people either going towards entertainment, material things, or both. So in the 1920s, after World War I, we've all heard the stories how we were in the roaring 20s and there's the age of the flapper, the Great Gatsby and all that kind of stuff. And everybody was going to speakeasies because prohibition was a law of the land at that time. And during the 1920s, after the war, the mood of the United States at least was, look, we just came out of a bad time. We don't want to hear anything bad. We want to focus on enjoying ourselves. And so we are going to live it up because we went through some really hard times. It was sad. It was hard. Don't bring any bad news. All we want is fun. As a nation, it all became very focused on self. I just want to have fun. I want to do what I want to do. I don't want to think about bad things. And so people just threw themselves into parties and alcohol and speakeasies, and crime was super high. Now, a lot of that had to do with prohibition, but it was very high because everybody was just looking out for me, myself, and I, and they just wanted what they wanted. Also, during this time, people were spending exorbitant amounts of money that they didn't really have, which is going to eventually lead to the stock market crash and the depression. But everybody just wanted stuff, right? They had to sacrifice during the war. Now we want things. We want to keep up with the Joneses. And one of the presidents, I think it was Calvin Coolidge, said, 2 chickens in every pot and a car in the garage. That's what all Americans need, which was his way of saying, now is the time for prosperity. And prosperity isn't wrong, but we took it too far. And so everybody was buying things on credit. And, that's another history lesson for another day. But what we saw was our moral fabric in our country kind of disintegrate. And we didn't really get pulled out of it until World War II. And the reason why is because World War II forced us out of our own heads and forced us out of our own, selfish tendencies and made us think about other things, right? We had to go fight the bad guys. We had a moral cause. And the women had to go to work to support, all the factories and the making of all the, war weapons and all of that. They were pulled out of all of that. And collectively as a country, we came together and we were united as one to go against our enemies in Germany and Japan. And so that's a big reason why we see that generation as the greatest generation, because they sacrificed, they gave of themselves, they returned to God and moral purpose and all of those things. And they saw their lives as having a purpose. And so that's why we look up to that generation so much. And then that started to slide in the 1960s, and we got people like Sartre who are telling us about existentialism. And, people always want something new because they always think the new thing is really going to be the answer to their problems. But we have this problem now with entertainment and material things. Now, the material things have kind of shifted. A lot of younger generations don't want stuff, but they want experiences. And they want to say, oh, I've done that. They have the bucket list mentality, which I cannot stand. They just want to mark things off to prove to other people that they're cool and they're traveled and they've experienced a lot of things. And this was really exemplified to me one time when my family was at Zion National Park. We had gone on this hike and we came to this kind of a pond, I guess, that had a really high cliff. It was extremely beautiful. There were tons of people there. Everybody's taking their pictures, doing the selfie thing. I'm not against taking pictures. I actually love pictures, but hear me out. And everybody would come in, they'd hike in. It was the end of that particular trail. They'd hike in, take a selfie, walk away. And my family was there and we were getting in the water and, looking at the cliff in front of us, and there were some trees to sit under, and it was just really beautiful and breathtaking. And I noticed this couple, and they looked to be, modern day kind of hippies. That's how they were dressed. And they were standing in the water barefoot. I had seen them on the trail and they were walking barefoot. I was like, wow, you guys are brave. Because there's rocks and everything. But they were standing in the water and they had their arms around each other, and they were just gazing at everything with these smiles on their faces that exuded pure joy. And they never once got out a camera. They didn't take a selfie. They didn't capture the moment. Nothing. And I was sitting there watching them, beauty and creation. And all around them, everybody else was just scurrying like buzzing bees. Just get your picture, and then we leave, and get your picture, blah, blah, blah. I marked this off my bucket list. And then there was this couple, and it was like they had a dome over them, and like time stood still for them. And I looked at them and I said, yes, they have it right. They came out here to truly immerse themselves in being in creation and, enjoying this moment. And I'm so impressed with them. I was so impressed. And it really made me think about how I approach life. Do I just hurry up to do it in order to have an experience, or am I really immersing myself in all of it? And that was so profound to me. And I don't know if anybody else noticed them, but I sure did. But I think this is why so many people are melancholy today, because they, for one, throw themselves into entertainment. And, at some point you can only watch so much Netflix before you're bored out of your mind, but then they don't know what else to do. And so they just scroll through social media, and that's their form of entertainment. And then it gets worse and worse and worse. And sometimes it gets, downright sinful and evil, and they fall into bad things. But then there's also the materialistic side. And today it's the collecting of experiences. but nobody's really doing it for the enjoyment of it. I can't tell you how many times people have said, oh yeah, I crossed that off my bucket list. Don't ever need to do that again. But why? There was somebody when we were in Turkey, we went on a hot air balloon ride. And I was like, oh man, didn't you love it? And they're like, yep, crossed it off my bucket list. Don't have to do that again. And when I went on the hot air balloon ride, I thought of that person. I was like, why would you never want to do this again? This is amazing. And I think it's because we're not doing it because of the true joy of that thing. We're doing it because I just want everybody to think I'm cool. I want to have evidence and proof that, I did this. So everybody thinks that I'm cultured and traveled and all of that. And it just makes us melancholy. So I've talked a lot about all of that, but how do we fix this? How do we fix this in our lives? Well, I tell you what, Christ and his church give us the answer. Number one, fasting. And I don't mean just fasting from food, though that is good. Fasting from pleasures, because when we fast and deny ourselves, we are disciplining ourselves and we are training ourselves to say no every once in a while. And then the pleasure, when we do get to experience it and, kind of indulge ourselves in it, is so much better. And the church teaches us to fast. If you look through the liturgical calendar, it's fasting and feasting, fasting and feasting. Why? Because as humans, we need that. We cannot feast all the time. The second is grounding ourselves in our faith in God and understanding that, yes, God breathed us into existence. And yes, he gave us an essence. He gave us a purpose. He gave us a path in life that he wants us to go down. And now it's not rigid. It's not so rigid that if we get off the path a little bit, well, too bad for you. No, it's way different than that. We can find our path in different ways. Doors can close and we go around and we find another door. But knowing that we have a purpose, knowing that life is not purposeless and meaningless, and sharing that with other people and living our lives in such a way helps us to not be melancholy. I'll end with this. I was telling my husband, I don't even remember the last time I was actually melancholy. I think it was when I was in college. Now in college, I had turned away from God and I really was trying to throw myself into pleasures. And I do remember feeling kind of a prolonged, deep sadness. And that's because I had lost my purpose. I had lost, my focal point on Christ. And I was just trying to fill that with things and parties and, sensual pleasures and all those kinds of things. None of it was working. Since, my rebirth back into Christ, I have not felt that way at all. Of course I have bad days and stuff like that. I have not felt melancholy at all. And, I think that is the key is to deny ourselves, to be disciplined, to not indulge in everything, and to stay close to Christ, because he is the only way of being delivered from a life of disillusionment that is caused by melancholy. So that is all for this week, Catholic Pilgrims. I will see you back here for week 18. And until then, live the faith boldly and travel well.